Is it true that Billy the Kid met his end in a shadowed room at Fort Sumner on July 14, 1881? Or did the American frontier successfully guard his secret for generations? For over 100 years, speculation has persisted that the West's most legendary criminal did not perish that evening. The detail that fuels this theory? Years afterward, the widow of Pat Garrett confessed that her own husband had his uncertainties. These uncertainties would transform a single shooting into one of the frontier's most enduring unsolved cases. Remain with me. This evening, we will move, point by point, through the established account, the hushed rumors indeed, and the peculiar evidence that sustained the kid's myth long after his reported demise. The plains of New Mexico were just adjusting to a fragile new tranquility following the Lincoln County War, a vicious, complex conflict that resulted in the deaths of comrades and the destruction of standing. A principal character in this war was a lanky, fast-shooting youth with a smile and an immortal name, William H. Bonney, Billy the Kid. He had been a cattle thief, an escape artist, and a murderer, according to some reports. To certain people, he was a ruthless felon. To others, he was the outcome of a crooked establishment that had forced a young man into a life of brutality. During the summer of 1881, the Kid was a fugitive. He had escaped from the Lincoln County Jail in April after slaying 2 deputies. The territory's governor and numerous citizens desired his death. The sheriff, Pat Garrett, was intent on his apprehension. Garrett pursued Billy across the open range, and the pursuit concluded, as per the official version, late on a night in July with a moon overhead at the Maxwell Ranch in Fort Sumner. The conventional narrative is brief and striking. On July 14, 1881, Garrett visited the residence of his friend, Pedro Pete Maxwell, to inquire about the outlaw's whereabouts. After consulting with Maxwell, Garrett remained inside the darkened residence. The Kid, who had been quartered nearby, unexpectedly entered Maxwell's bedroom and, as Garrett later testified, failed to identify the shadowy figure. When Billy uttered, "Quien es? Quien es?" meaning, "Who is it?" Garrett discharged his weapon twice. The initial round struck the outlaw in the heart, and he fell, lifeless. Garrett would later state that it was the voice that gave him away. A coroner's inquest officially closed the case. Newspapers nationwide published the brief telegrams announcing that Billy the Kid was dead. Pictures were taken of the body, and a burial site was designated for the young fugitive. For those who preferred a clear-cut story, it was a satisfying conclusion. A wanted man finally hunted down and killed. Yet a neat ending is not always a truthful one. Almost from the start, the official version faced skepticism. Residents of Fort Sumner murmured that the deceased individual did not resemble the Kid. Others contended the lighting was too dim to clearly distinguish any face. A deputy who was present later changed his initial statement. An associate suggested Pete Maxwell had motives to be deceitful, and some of Billy's closest acquaintances insisted the body was missing distinctive features they remembered. Even Garrett's own accounts were contradictory. On some occasions, he firmly affirmed he had killed the Kid and put this in writing. At other times, he seemed less sure, alluding to uncertainty or even remorse. Historians have highlighted these discrepancies, along with the rushed nature of the inquest, as grounds to doubt whether the 1881 narrative represents the complete truth. The mystery persisted for generations until an elderly man named Brushy Bill Roberts emerged in 1949, proclaiming, "I am Billy the Kid." Roberts alleged he had lived under an assumed identity for decades, having been allowed to escape that night in Fort Sumner, and had ultimately made a life for himself in Texas. His application for an official pardon, supported by an extensive recollection of details from the Kid's life, reignited the controversy. Many found his story compelling. Roberts provided names, locations, and personal memories that seemed too intricate and specific for a simple fraud. Others identified inconsistencies in his account and questioned his stated age and origins. Brushy Bill's assertion failed to provide definitive proof. Governor Thomas Mabry denied the pardon request, and numerous investigators determined Roberts was probably a fraud. Nevertheless, the Brushy Bill tale persistently raised the same troubling question. What if Garrett had been mistaken or had wished to be? This is where the narrative grows more shadowy, strange, and compelling. Years after the shooting and after Pat Garrett's own death in 1908, a sworn affidavit surfaced much later. It claimed that Apollonia, or Apollinaria Garrett, the sheriff's widow, told a childhood friend that her husband had not killed Billy the Kid. The affidavit, gathered decades afterward by a man named Homer Overton, states that Apollonia informed Overton and another boy that Garrett and the Kid had shot an intoxicated man in Fort Sumner and presented the body as Billy's to conclude the manhunt. This claim, if accepted, transforms the established tale from a straightforward pursuit into a potential conspiracy. Consider the implication. The widow of the man credited with the killing allegedly told a neighbor that her husband knew or believed he had killed the wrong man. She implied Garrett may have collaborated in disguising a body to resemble Bonnie. Historians approach this affidavit warily. The events were described decades after the fact by a man who was only 9 years old at the time. But this testimony nourished the Brushy Bill story and guaranteed the question would never be entirely resolved. If Garrett did fabricate or misidentify the body, several motives could explain it. The frontier desperately wanted closure. A governor demanded the death of a notorious fugitive. Financial rewards were at stake. Garrett himself had invested years tracking Billy. Many felt he needed this victory for his career, reputation, and perhaps for monetary reasons. There is also a personal dimension. Garrett and Billy had once been something other than outright enemies, acquaintances with a complicated history. Some authors have even proposed that Garrett, weary of violence, may have desired an end without a prolonged, bloody chase and orchestrated a way to halt the cycle. Yet, motive is not the same as evidence. The gaps in the historical record, the changing stories, and the emotional claims from people decades removed from the events generate more speculation than certainty. Yet the presence of that smoke is itself significant. If nothing else, it reveals how untidy the truth can become when it is interred within a legend. Historians upholding the official account cite contemporary evidence. Garrett's own narrative, the coroner's jury, statements from eyewitnesses like Deputy John Poe and Thomas McKinney, and the swift interment in Fort Sumner. Archaeological efforts and repeated attempts to reopen the investigation have all failed to dislodge the established claim. Garrett himself wrote letters later in his life affirming that he had, in fact, shot Billy. Some of his relatives preserved artifacts and correspondence that corroborate this position. There exists a substantial stack of documents supporting the conventional story. Conversely, skeptics highlight that only Garrett and his deputies were certain of the identity that night. The lighting was bad, the memories of witnesses conflicted, and the burial was conducted with haste. Decades later, a handful of testimonies, including Apollonia Garrett's alleged comments and Brushy Bill's own account, presented a competing history, suggesting the final chapter might not yet be written. Which version do you believe when the original participants disagreed and the passage of time erodes all certainty? Brushy Bill Roberts demonstrated specific granular knowledge, names, origins, events that occasionally aligned with the known facts of Billy's life. He maintained that he survived Fort Sumner, escaped, and lived for decades under an assumed identity. However, forensic doubts persistently shadowed him. Census records, birth dates, and other testimonies did not align perfectly. When he finally stood before Governor Mabry in 1950, the old man's memory faltered. He could not recall critical names and was unable to substantiate every detail. The governor consequently denied the pardon. Roberts died without being officially recognized as Billy the Kid. Nevertheless, Roberts garnered supporters. A fascinated public was captivated by the drama of a mythical outlaw aging into obscurity in a small Texas town. The legend of Brushy Bill fueled local tourism, enriched regional folklore, and perpetuated the stubborn notion that the official record is sometimes amended for expediency. Into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, investigators applied new methods. They proposed genetic testing and fresh analyses of the purported grave sites, aiming to match bones or artifacts with living descendants and authenticated photographs. Initiatives were launched to excavate burial plots, and several museums obtained letters and personal effects linked to Garrett that appeared to validate his version of events. However, exhumations are complex, and many of the relevant graves had been compromised by flooding and the passage of time. Consequently, scientists have never been able to deliver a conclusive genetic verdict that settles the debate one way or the other. The enigma persisted, remaining unresolved. The alleged statement from Apollonia Garrett that her husband harbored uncertainties functions like a whisper from a century past that simply will not fade. Whether her words were meant literally or were amplified by the passage of time, the outcome is identical. It compels us to keep questioning. In the study of history, doubt is frequently more compelling than certainty. It prompts us to reevaluate evidence, to scrutinize motives, to re-examine old correspondence, and to consult with descendants. If Garrett did, in fact, orchestrate a deception, or if he merely came to doubt his own actions later in life, the resulting moral dilemma is profound. A man who hunted a young outlaw to his death might have ended his own days plagued by the possibility of a tragic error. This is the haunting specter that Apollonia's words suggest, and it is the very reason the legend persists. So, where does that leave us? The official record stands firm in the history books. Pat Garrett shot and killed Billy the Kid. The legend, however, refuses to die in the whispers of the wind. We are left not with an answer, but with a choice. Do we believe the cold, hard evidence of the inquest and Garrett's own pen? Or do we trust the chilling, decades-later confession of a widow and the desperate plea of an old man who stepped out of the shadows, claiming to be a ghost? Perhaps the most powerful truth isn't found in a grave, but in the very persistence of the doubt itself. The story of Billy the Kid endures not because it ended neatly, but because it didn't. It forces us to question not just what we know, but how we know it. It reminds us that history is often not a single fact, but a conversation, an argument between the official record and the human story. And that conversation is now yours to continue. The evidence is before you. I'll leave you with this final thought. What if, on that moonlit night in Fort Sumner, the West's most famous outlaw didn't die, but simply escaped into the one place he could live forever? A legend? We want to hear from you. What do you believe really happened? Vote in the poll and let us know in the comments below. Did Billy die in 1881? Or did he get away?